The centerpiece of my dining room table was the ceramic turkey I'd painted with my daughter 23 years ago. Back when her hands were small enough to fit inside mine, I'd set it out every Christmas since then, right between the candles and the poinsettia, because some things you hold on to, not because they're beautiful, but because they're yours. That Christmas Eve, I watched my son-in-law carry it to the kitchen counter without asking. "It's in the way," he said. I didn't say anything. I should have. But I'd been not saying things for 2 years by then, and silence had become a habit I wore like a second skin. My name is Audrey. I'm 68 years old. I taught third grade for 31 years in Dayton, Ohio, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that I have never in my life met a child as calculating as the man my daughter married. I say that not with bitterness anymore. I say it because it's simply true. And because I've learned the hard way, the expensive way, that calling something by its right name is the first step to surviving it. Let me back up. My husband, Frank, passed in the spring of 2019. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which sounds merciful until you're living it and realize there's nothing merciful about 6 weeks. We'd been married 41 years. We had one daughter, Cassie, who was 34 at the time and already married to a man named Troy. I didn't like Troy from the beginning, which I'll admit freely. He had the kind of smile that arrived a half-second too late, like he was always calculating whether smiling was worth the effort. But Cassie loved him, and Cassie was my daughter. So I folded my opinion into a small square and put it somewhere I wouldn't look at it. After Frank died, I stayed in our house. Our house, the one on Clover Mill Road that we'd bought in 1988 for $94,000 and paid off by 2011. 4 bedrooms, a yard with a dogwood tree Frank planted the year Cassie was born. That house was paid for. That house was mine. I want you to understand that because it matters later. For about 8 months, I managed fine. Then my hips started giving me trouble. Nothing surgical, just the ordinary betrayal of a body that's been in use for 66 years. My doctor suggested I think about whether living alone was still the right situation. Cassie called twice a week. Troy called 0 times, but that wasn't new. It was Cassie who first floated the idea. "Mom, we have the room. The basement apartment has its own entrance, its own bathroom. You'd have your privacy, and we'd all feel better." I thought about it for 2 months. I want you to know that too. I wasn't naive. I was careful. I visited 3 times to see the space. I asked questions. I talked to my friend Norma, who told me, "Don't do it," in a tone that should have settled it. But Cassie cried on the phone one Sunday and said, "I just lost Dad. I can't lose you too. Not like this. Not from a fall in an empty house at 2 in the morning." And that was it. That was the thing that moved me. I rented out my house on Clover Mill Road to a young couple, a nurse and a school teacher, for $1,400 a month. That money went directly into a separate account. I kept my finances separate. I was that careful. I moved into the basement apartment of my daughter's house in Glendale, Ohio in October 2021, with my furniture and my ceramic turkey and 26 boxes of a life I'd spent 40 years building. The first year wasn't bad. It wasn't what I'd hoped. Troy ate dinner in his office most nights, and when he did join us, he talked about his work in commercial real estate in a way that left no room for other conversation. But Cassie and I had our Tuesday mornings. Coffee, crossword puzzles, sometimes a drive to the garden center even in winter just to walk around. Those mornings kept me going. Then Cassie got pregnant. This should have been only good news, and in the ways that mattered I was going to be a grandmother, and I felt that truth settle into me like something I hadn't known I'd been waiting for. But pregnancy changed the house. Troy became more present, more territorial in a way I couldn't quite name at first. He started making comments. Small ones. "Mom, the wash has been running since 6 a.m. Mom, the driveway only fits 2 cars. Never in front of Cassie. Always when it was just us. I told myself it was stress. First baby coming, mortgage, his business going through a slow quarter. I made excuses for him the way you do when making excuses is easier than facing what's in front of you. The baby came in March. A boy. Cassie named him Owen, and the first time I held him, I stood at the window with him and thought, Frank would have loved this so much. I cried into that baby's blanket, and he didn't mind at all. Then Owen was 4 months old, and it was a Thursday evening in July when everything changed. Troy came downstairs. He never came downstairs. I had my door open because the evening was cool for once, and I'd been sitting with a book, and I heard his footstep on the bottom stair before I saw him. He was carrying a folder. "We need to talk about some things," he said. He didn't sit down. He stood near the door and opened the folder on the small table just inside my entrance, the one where I keep my keys and Cassie's school picture from 1994. Inside the folder were 2 documents. One was a lease agreement. One was a document I didn't recognize. The lease agreement was for the basement apartment, $1,850 a month, backdated January of that year, meaning, according to this document, I owed 6 months of back rent totaling $11,100. My name was typed at the bottom of the signature line. The signature itself was not mine. I looked at it for a long time. I looked at him. "What is this?" I said. "It's the rental agreement for the space," he said. "We should have formalized this earlier. Better for everybody's taxes." "My signature is on this document," I said, "and I didn't sign it." Something moved across his face, not guilt. Closer to irritation, like a man who'd walked a chess piece confidently across the board and was mildly annoyed it hadn't ended the game. I had a property management attorney draw it up based on market rate. The second document is a promissory note for the back amount. We're not asking for it all at once. Monthly payments would be fine. I picked up the second document. It referenced my property on Clover Mill Road as collateral. My rental property. The one generating $1,400 a month that Troy apparently knew about and had apparently been thinking about for longer than this conversation suggested. I set both papers down carefully. I am a woman who spent 31 years managing 23 8-year-olds at a time, and I know the value of not showing your hand. "I need to look these over," I said. "Of course," he said and left. I closed my door. I sat down on my couch, the one Frank and I bought at a furniture store in 1997, and I put my face in my hands. Not because I was defeated. I was frightened. There's a difference, and fear deserves a moment before you push through it. I did not tell Cassie that night. This is the decision I've revisited most. I know some people would say I should have got upstairs immediately. But Cassie was 4 months postpartum, still nursing, sleeping in 2-hour stretches. And I didn't yet know what I was dealing with. I didn't want to blow apart her marriage based on a folder I'd held for 10 minutes until I understood what was actually in it. I called Norma instead. Norma had been my friend since 1989, and her late husband had been a real estate attorney. She came over the next morning and sat at my kitchen table and read both documents twice. "The signature on this lease," she said, "is not your handwriting." "No," I said. "And this promissory note lists your property as collateral." "Yes." She looked at me over her reading glasses. "Audrey, do you have a real estate attorney?" I did not. I had a general attorney who'd handled Frank's estate, a kind man named, I'm going to call him Mr. Doyle because I've found privacy matters when you're telling true stories, and I called him that afternoon. He referred me to a colleague who specialized in real estate and elder financial law. Her name was Patricia. No, wait. I've already said I'm keeping names private where I can. I'll call her my attorney. My attorney was 62, wore her grey hair in a no-nonsense braid, and had the particular calm of someone who has heard every variety of human wrongdoing and is no longer surprised by any of it. She was, in the language of my field, an excellent classroom manager. We met that Friday. I brought both documents, my deed to Clover Mill Road, my lease with my tenants, and 18 months of my bank statements. I also brought something else, something I'd thought to do, quietly, on my own. The morning after Troy had come downstairs. When Troy had left my apartment, he'd left the folder on my table. He'd taken his copies, but he'd left mine. So that Thursday night, after I'd sat for a while and my fear had shifted into something colder and more useful, I'd gone upstairs while Troy was in his office with the door shut, and Cassie was nursing Owen in the bedroom. I'd stood in the kitchen and photographed every document in the house filing drawer, the mortgage, the utilities, the insurance. I'd done this calmly, in the kitchen light, in about 12 minutes. Then I'd gone back downstairs. My attorney spread everything across her conference table. She was quiet for a long time. "The signature on this lease is a forgery," she said. "That's not an opinion. I'd stake my license on it, and we'll have a forensic document examiner confirm it. More importantly, the promissory note attempts to place a lien on your property using that forged lease as its legal basis. That's fraud. That's not a civil disagreement. That's a crime." I nodded. I'd known it, but hearing it named steadied something in me. "Has he attempted to file this promissory note anywhere? Recorded it with the county?" We checked. He hadn't. Not yet. We were early enough. "Here's what we do," my attorney said. "I won't walk through every legal step because honestly some of it I didn't fully understand in the moment, and I don't want to misinform you. What I can tell you is this. Within 10 days, we had filed a preemptive, quiet title action on my Clover Mill Road property, which essentially put a legal flag in the ground that said this property is mine, cleanly and without encumbrance, before any fraudulent document could be recorded against it. My attorney also sent a formal letter to Troy, certified return receipt, informing him that both documents had been identified as fraudulent, that the forged signature constituted criminal forgery under Ohio law, and that we were prepared to refer the matter to the county prosecutor. We gave him 14 days to respond in writing, confirming he would make no further claims and destroy all copies of both documents. Now, Cassie, I had to tell her. I'd been waiting until I had something concrete, not a frightened mother's suspicion, but documented fact, and now I had it. I called her on a Tuesday morning, our regular time, and I asked if I could come upstairs without Troy present. She said he had a site visit until 3. I sat at her kitchen table with my coffee cup in both hands, and I told her everything. I laid the documents out in front of her, the way my attorney had laid them out in front of me. I showed her the signature, and I showed her my actual signature on a dozen other documents so she could see for herself. Cassie didn't speak for a very long time. When she did, the first thing she said was, "He told me you'd agreed to pay rent. He said you'd both talked about it and you felt better having it official." "He said that to you?" "Yes." There it was. He'd already prepared her, already planted the version of events where I was a willing participant, where the paperwork was just a formality, where my attorney was an overreaction. I'd taught children long enough to recognize a lie that had been rehearsed. Cassie cried. I held her, or she held me. Honestly, at some point we were just holding each other. Owen was asleep in the next room and the house was quiet, and my daughter kept saying, "I don't understand. I don't understand." And I just kept saying, "I know, baby. I know." Troy denied everything when the certified letter arrived. His attorney, yes, he immediately retained an attorney, sent back a response claiming the lease was a draft document for discussion purposes that I had reviewed and initialed at some earlier date, and that any resemblance to a final signature was a misunderstanding. This was impressively brazen given that the forensic document examiner had by then confirmed the signature was not mine and showed none of the natural variation of a real signature, suggesting it had been traced or digitally reproduced. The county prosecutor's office opened an inquiry. I won't use the word investigation yet because at that stage it was preliminary, but it was real and it had Troy's name in it. Here is the part I want to be honest about, because I think it's the part that people don't talk about enough in stories like mine. During all of this, the attorney meetings, the certified letters, the forensic examiner, I was still living in my daughter's basement. I want you to sit with that for a moment. Every morning I heard Troy's footstep above my head. Every evening I heard the baby crying and I wanted to go upstairs and help Cassie, but the geography of the house had become impossible. Cassie and I were texting constantly, sometimes until midnight, but she was still sleeping next to this man and making his coffee, and I was 67 years old, sitting in a basement apartment that suddenly felt less like a home and more like a position I'd backed myself into. My tenants on Clover Mill Road had given notice in April. The house was empty. I moved back in June. It was not the triumphant moment you might imagine. It was a Saturday. My friend Norma helped me load my things, and when I carried the ceramic turkey out to the car, Cassie stood on the front porch holding Owen on her hip and crying in a way that had nothing to do with wanting me to stay, and everything to do with wanting me to stay, and everything to do with grief for how things had become. I put the turkey carefully in the passenger seat and I drove home. Coming back to my own house after 19 months felt like putting on a coat that had been hanging in a closet. It fit, but there was a strangeness to it. I stood in my own kitchen and ran my hand along the counter and said out loud to no one, "Okay, Frank, I'm home." What happened with Troy, the prosecutor's inquiry led to a formal charge of document forgery. He ultimately accepted a plea arrangement. I was not party to that negotiation. That involved probation, a fine, mandatory restitution of his attorney's fees against our legal costs, and a formal acknowledgement that neither the lease document nor the promissory note had any legal validity. His real estate license, which he'd had for 11 years, was placed under review by the Ohio Division of Real Estate. What happened with Cassie is harder to describe because it doesn't fit into a legal timeline. She didn't leave him immediately. I won't pretend she did. She went to couples counseling, then to individual therapy, then to couples counseling again. She called me every other day. There were months where I felt her trying to hold two truths at once: the man she'd married and the man who'd forged her mother's signature. And I watched her struggle with that because I couldn't do it for her. The hardest thing I've ever done was not tell my daughter what choice to make. You raise children to be capable of their own decisions, and then you have to honor that capability even when you disagree with the direction it's going. Owen turned 1 in March. I was there for his birthday. I sat at the table in my daughter's kitchen and watched him smash his hands into a cake I'd made from scratch, and Troy sat at the far end of the table in a way that was careful and subdued and aware. We were not warm with each other. I don't know if we ever will be. But I was there. Cassie is still in counseling. I am proud of her for that. I want to tell you the thing I learned that I didn't expect to learn, because I came out of this thinking I'd learned about fraud and property law and the importance of keeping your own finances separate. And those things are true and important. But the thing I actually learned, the thing that changed the shape of how I move through the world, is this. The documents Troy forged were frightening. The legal process was exhausting and expensive, and there were nights in that basement apartment when I sat at my kitchen table at 2 in the morning and felt more alone than I've felt since the week Frank died. But none of that was the hardest part. The hardest part was the moment Cassie said, "He told me you'd agreed." Because that sentence told me that the plan wasn't just to take my property. The plan was to do it in a way that isolated me from my own daughter, to make me the problem, to put just enough of a story between us that even if I said something, even if I fought back, Cassie would have doubt. That's what the forgery was really for, not just the money. The money was almost secondary. I tell my story because I know I'm not the only one. I know there are women sitting in their children's houses right now, keeping their mouths shut, calling it being reasonable, calling it not wanting to cause problems, telling themselves it will get better. I was a woman who kept her finances separate and retained her own property and still found herself sitting in a basement at 2 in the morning, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. Trust what you see. Document what you can. Keep your own name on your own things. And when your friend Norma says don't do it, maybe just listen to Norma. Owen learned to walk in August. He crossed my living room floor in Clover Mill Road on a Saturday afternoon, arms out, grinning like he'd invented the concept. I caught him at the other end. He's so much like Cassie was at that age that sometimes it stops me cold. That same determined look, that same refusal to fall when she could instead just keep going. We're still figuring out the rest. But I caught him. And outside my window, the dogwood tree Frank planted is 40 years old and still blooming every spring without being asked. Some things hold. I think about that Thursday evening more than I expected to. Not the fear. The fear faded. What stayed is the image of Troy setting that folder on my table. So confident, so certain that a 67-year-old retired schoolteacher would sign what was put in front of her and call it reasonable. What he didn't account for was 31 years of watching human behavior up close. Children cannot hide what they intend. Neither, it turns out, can adults who stopped bothering to try. There's something I've come to believe about the way things unfold, not in any religious sense, but in the plain, observable way that actions tend to produce consequences that rhyme with the actions themselves. Troy spent years building a version of reality where he was the competent one, the provider, the person who handled things. And he believed that version so thoroughly that he forgot other people could also handle things. He underestimated me because he'd decided, somewhere along the way, that I was simply furniture in his house. That's the thing about treating people as less than they are. You stop seeing them clearly. You make mistakes. The mistake he made was leaving that folder on my table. I've been asked, since all of this came to light, whether I regret moving in with Cassie. I sat with that question honestly. What I regret is not listening more carefully to my own hesitation. There was a voice, quiet but present, that said, "Wait, think. Don't decide from grief." I was 8 months out from losing Frank, and I was tired of my own house being too silent, and I let that tiredness make a decision that my clearer self might have made differently. That's not self-blame. That's just accuracy, knowing the difference between a decision made from fear and a decision made from strength is something I had to learn the hard way, and I'd rather learn it than not. What carried me through wasn't luck. It was the habit built over decades of paying attention, of keeping records, of knowing which papers were mine and where they were. When I stood in that kitchen photographing documents at 11 o'clock at night, I wasn't being heroic. I was just doing what any person does when they understand that clarity is protection, that kind of clear-eyed thinking, the refusal to panic, the ability to look at a bad situation and ask, what do I actually know and what do I do next? That's a muscle. You build it quietly, over years, and you don't always know you have it until you need it. The courage part, and there was courage required, I won't pretend otherwise, wasn't the attorney or the legal filings. It was telling Cassie, sitting at her kitchen table, and showing my daughter evidence against her husband, knowing I might lose her in the process, knowing she might choose him, knowing the damage might be permanent. That was the morning I was most afraid. That fear had nothing to do with property. She didn't choose him over the truth. I am proud of her for that every single day. Owen is walking now, running actually. The full chaotic sprint of a 1-year-old who has discovered forward motion and sees no reason to stop. I watch him cross a room, and I think what I want for him more than anything is that he grows up knowing that doing right by people is not weakness, that thinking clearly is not coldness, and that staying standing when everything pushes you down is something you are capable of. Not because someone told him so, because he watched the people around him do it. That's all any of us can leave behind, really. Not property. Not paperwork, the example of how we handled it when it got hard.